right, here we go. So we're going to talk to you a little bit today about how we scaled up specifications grading for a large course. And originally we were going to talk about just the lab course, but we decided to actually add in another course as well. So we're going to talk about a different course first and then the lab course to give you a sense of how this goes from different size classes. If you have been at these other talks, you have met us before, but I will just quickly say I'm Renee Link. I'm a professor of teaching at UC Irvine in chemistry. I run giant lab programs. I'll talk more about that in a minute. I'll let Will introduce himself and then Kate.
Yeah, I'm Will. I'm one of the graduate students that worked with Renee during this whole process of scaling up the specifications grading course for her lab course of over 1,000 students. I'm now a faculty member myself, but at Georgia Tech.
And I'm Kate McNally, and I am all of the same things that Will just said, except I am now a faculty member at Emory University as a lecturer.
Okay, so we like to do acknowledgements first, so we don't run out of time for them. So we're going to do those really quickly. We could not have done any of what you're about to see without the help of Simon Lamb. He is our stockroom manager that helps us keep the giant lab classes running. He handles all the class stock solution and lab prep, manages his own team of undergrad staff, and we could not do anything without Simon. We also want to acknowledge Taylor Thane, who is the head TA when we actually put the specs grading into place with the giant lab class. So she went along with all of our wild ideas and said, okay, sure, we'll do that. And then I'm also going to tell you about a lecture class that I did just this past summer. So I want to just acknowledge now Dr. Mike Morris. He was a grad student at the time, but he was a development TA for the class. I'll explain why I managed to get some development help later on. Alex Liu is a grad student TA for the class. So again, went along with my wild ideas. Let's do this thing in this online class in the middle of the pandemic. And Elizabeth Dwan, who is an undergrad learning assistant, who also was incredibly helpful in doing this. I'm going to take to pitch the idea of run what you're planning past an undergrad first. Their insight is incredibly valuable. We did this with some of our lab components and it was great. And I ran everything in the lecture class past Elizabeth. It was really helpful. We also want to thank, of course, the TEED program for having us here to talk with you, UCI Chemistry, and the students and TAs of these courses for, again, supporting us in doing this and going along with it. And I do a thank you in every one of my talks to Buster and Apollo, who may show up at some point in the background, or you may hear them at some point because they are very good at keeping me going. Okay, so one of the things I want to mention is a quick talk about scale, because scale is really a relative thing. So let me give you a sense of what I do on a regular basis. I run almost all of the organic labs with the exception of the special chem agents and honors sequence at UCI, which means for me, a class typically looks something like this. If you were in the very first talk of the sequence, you've seen it before, but it's a fun one to see again. Each of these represents 100 students. You will count that as 13. I regularly have somewhere between 1,000 and 1,400 students. Right now it's 1,388. That means I get TAs. So each of our scientist anteater icons here represents 6 grad students. So right now I have 36 grad student TAs. I can't manage all this by myself, so I get a stockroom manager, that's Simon, and 1 to 2 head TAs. So Will and Kate were head TAs in the past. Taylor, you saw, and I currently have 2 head TAs helping me run things. And then there's me, basically running a medium-sized company within a large university. Of course, I have no training on how to do that, but we make it work. So scale for me may be a little bit different than it is for you. So as we go through our talk today, I'm going to talk about a smaller class and then a large class. So I just want to define what I mean by small and large, because it may be very different from what it means for you. So for me, a small class is about 50 to 100 students, because that's as small as my classes ever get. So I'm going to talk about a small class first, and that's what I'm talking about. For me, medium's a few hundred, and my large, massive classes, we're talking 4 digits. So scale is relative. So when I say small, you feel free to translate that to large in your head if 100 is large for you or 50 is large for you, just to make sure we're all on the same page of what we're talking about. All right, so the first thing I'm going to tell you about is how I did specifications grading in a flipped online lecture summer class. All of those things, mainly because for me, this is a small class, but I thought it was useful to talk about how I strategically design things to keep it manageable at this particular course size. type of class. So first, let me give you some context for the class. So this is the first lecture course in a 3-course sequence. And I do really, really mean sequence here because the content of this class is really crucial for students to be successful in the next 2 classes. So it's not a sequence in the sense of like these just come one after the other. It's a sequence as in if you do not get the fundamentals of this class, you will absolutely struggle in the future classes. And we actually have some work on that. Susan King, who's actually here today, I see Susan's video, did some work looking at how students do in future classes depending on how they did in this first one. So it really is a crucial fundamental foundational course. This class is mainly taken by biosci majors, public health science, chemistry, pharmaceutical sciences, a handful of engineering majors, and anyone who wants to go on to be a doctor, pharmacist, dentist, optometrist, fill in your health profession here. So it's a class that a lot of students across the campus take. The specific course I'm talking about is normally a 10-week course in the regular academic term, but I'm talking about a summer class, so it's condensed down to 5 weeks. So it is a shortened accelerated course. I typically have about 60 to 100 students in this class because it is a summer class, it is an off-sequence class. So what that means is I have a kind of mixed student population. I have students who are taking the class to get ahead, and I have students who are taking it because they have failed 1 or more chemistry classes previously. So it is a very mixed population of class. It's a very interesting class to teach because of that. I get 1 TA for the course typically, although in this particular iteration, I did get a second person as a development TA. That is because I had 2 weeks to put a flipped in-person class into an online format. And we were being strongly encouraged not to use any proctoring software, which I completely agree with. And so I leveraged that encouragement and said, great, if you want me to do that, please give me an extra person to help me build lots of assessments. And I was able to get that done. But normally I just have 1 grad student TA for the class. And sometimes I'll have learning assistants or peer tutors. That really varies depending on the year because it's summer. And then there's me running the course. So how did I take this and turn it into specs grading? I had already done specs grading in the lab course, so I'm doing these chronologically out of order. So I had some experience with specs grading already, and I knew I wanted to convert this class into a specs format. Because I already had some experience with specs, I knew that there were different ways to organize your grade bundles. And I knew because this is a foundational course in a sequence that I wanted it to be core and objective version that we talked about in a previous seminar in this series. So I started out by looking at what objectives do I have for the course. I lined these up previously when I was doing my flipped class work, and I had 66 total objectives, and that's a lot. But I did first go through and initially categorize them. I went through and thought, okay, what are the things that you really absolutely need to know to have any chance at success in the next course in the sequence? And I categorized those as essential. So those are the blue circles here. And then I said, okay, everything else I'm going to consider higher level. They're good. You should try to know them, but you're not going to absolutely fail the next class in the sequence if you don't get these right now. So I classified those as higher level. So I just split these into 2 level of my learning outcomes or learning objectives here. 66 was still a lot. So I tried to condense them down as much as I could, and I got down to 24 essentials and 18 higher level. This is still more than we've seen in some previous examples, but I have not been able to figure out how to get these down any further. And again, I think it's really because there's so many things in this course where if you don't know them in the next course, you're really going to struggle. So I can't figure out how to condense this any further. So I've got it down to 24 and 18, but I'm going to keep trying to whittle it down. Okay. So I got down to my objectives or my outcomes here, and I thought, okay, great. How do I want to assess these? A lot of examples that you see in specs will do 1 assessment per outcome. And I thought about that for a while, and I just could not figure out how to do that. For a couple of reasons. One, because I couldn't figure out how to track it well in something like Canvas without it being overwhelming. The second reason was that this is a 5-week class. And I thought this is just going to be assessment overload if I try to do this in 5 weeks. And so what I did then is said, okay, we're just going to combine these by chapter. Essentially, we cover 8 chapters in the class. It's not evenly distributed how many essential and higher level are in each one, but I said, you know what, this is just how I'm going to do this. So rather than have essential outcome quizzes for each essential outcome. I'm going to group it by outcomes for the chapter and do it that way. So each chapter had an essential and a higher level. So, and you'll see they're not evenly distributed, but that's okay. It worked out in the end, and I was fine with how it came out. Right. So I've got my plan. Here's the things I'm going to try to assess in the class. How am I going to actually do that? And then how does that translate to letter grades? Okay. Oh, sorry. Before I get to that, I meant to show you an example of how I consolidated things. So an example of like, here's some detailed outcomes I had initially, like identify acid and base, determine relative acidity using a pKa value and relative basicity using pKa values. I was really able to just condense that down into one thing that says, identify that this is an acid or base and use the pKa to assess that. Simple. And then for a higher level one where I want them to use literally just the structure to say which of these is more or less acidic, which of these is more or less basic. Well, that's a good skill to have. I had to classify that one as a higher level one because you can get by if you know how to look up the pKa's without just looking at the structure. So I decided, okay, we can put these together and call that a higher level. So it's just a quick example of how you might condense these. You're going to have to figure out what works for you. This is the thing that I found that worked particularly for me. All right, so how did this go into assessments? So I did entirely quizzes for assessments, no exams, no midterms, exception of a final, which I'll talk about in a second. So for the essential learning outcomes, these were quizzes in Canvas, which is our LMS. And I did question banks. So this is where that came in, having the extra person to help me build a lot of questions rapidly because I had so little time to do this. What I used Mike for was like, I need you to write me a whole bunch of multiple choice questions on these topics. And then I built Canvas quizzes that pulled from question banks. Each bank was tied to one of the ELOs, the actual learning outcomes. And then I used that to build the chapter quizzes. And so the target was to have usually about 2 questions per outcome. And that way a student could miss a question on the quiz and still pass, but they would still hit each of the outcomes, even if they missed a question or 2. I let the students take it twice for free. Any additional assessment, any additional reassessment required a token. I wanted to make sure they were retaining things because I wasn't having a midterm or a final. So I had them do a re-quiz, exactly the same quiz, but again, it's pulling from question banks, so they'd get different versions of the questions a few days later, because I want to make sure they're retaining the information, not just memorizing for that quiz and dumping it. So these were just auto-graded. I did ask them to explain why they were making their answer choices, but I didn't grade that. It was more for them to think about why they were choosing what they were choosing, but I also used it as a resource for myself so I could go look at what they were saying and address any issues I saw coming up during our class time. For the higher level outcomes, this is where I focused my grading time and my effort and my TA's effort. So these were open-ended questions meant to test these higher level outcomes, things where I wanted them to draw things for me, write things out, write out explanations. They submitted these as Canvas assignments, and I'll talk more in a minute about how I actually graded those. I also had some group activities because it's a flipped class. We had optional synchronous sessions where we did group activities together. I had them turn those in just to keep them accountable. Credit, no credit, really simple, quick yes or no. I also gave them the option of doing a weekly learning reflection or a concept map. And again, complete and complete. There's one other thing that's not up here. I do have online homework. That's just normal percent grading because there's really no good way to adjust online homework systems at this point. Okay, so the final exam was entirely optional. And I had learned from the experience we had in spring that this was probably going to be a good idea just in case things happened. So all they needed to do was to hit their quizzes. And if they didn't do that, they could make up for any missed quiz passing by doing the final. And so what I did with the final is I wrote 2 versions or 2 portions, an ELO portion and an HLO portion. And then within that, I labeled, these are the chapter 1 questions. These are the chapter 2 questions. These are the chapter 3 questions. And going into the final, they knew what they hadn't earned credit for yet. And so just do things you haven't earned credit for. You don't need to do anything else. So about 20 students took the ELO final and 12 took the HLO final. Most of those students only did 1 or 2 sections. I had like 2 students who had to do everything. It's because they were kind of checked out for a lot of the class, but most people just did little pieces of it. Okay, so as far as grades went, 8 out of 8 quizzes and re-quizzes were required. This is because these were the essential things. The students kind of pushed back on this, but I had to convince them like these are essential. If you don't have these, you're going to really struggle in the next class. So that's why you have to get all 8. For a B or an A, this is where the HLO quizzes came in. And you can see I set this a little bit lower. So they really put the real emphasis on the essentials and then gave them some leeway in the higher level outcomes. Everything that wasn't ELO or HLO quizzes went into the plus minus category, just to keep it really simple. All right, so I want to give you a little insight into how I structured the HLO quiz grading, because that's where we were putting our time, but I still wanted to make sure it was manageable for me and the TA who was helping with this, Alex. Also because again, 5-week class. So we had to have really fast turnaround on all of these things. So the way we structured this was, this is an assignment in Canvas and it has a rubric, but I actually did not put any detail at all in the rubric. The rubric is just this question or this piece of the question. For multi-part questions, I would break it up a little bit. And it's just yes or no. Did you get this piece or did you not? There is no criteria, no feedback, and there's a reason for that. The students can see which pieces they got right. The passing was set to 1 fewer than the total. So if the total was like 6, the passing level was 5. If they did not earn credit on the first try, they had the option to revise and resubmit through quiz corrections. But again, I had not told them why it was wrong, and this was strategic. I'll explain why in a second. So what I wanted them to do was identify what they missed, figure out why, and give a really good markup of their original answer. Tell me what you did wrong and tell me why it was wrong. Very, very clearly and specifically. Then write me a new correct answer and then submit that. And they could do that for every rubric item that they didn't get. I did give them some guidance because again, they're not getting feedback. So I'll explain how I gave that in a second. But this was strategic for me to save my grading time. I didn't want to put a lot of time giving feedback, partly because I wanted them to figure out what they were doing wrong. So I built that into the correction piece. This also having this as an assignment, and I don't know if this works for all LMSs, but it works well for this in Canvas. When they upload the new assignment, the previously marked rubric stays. So as an instructor, all I have to do is go back and look at what they missed, and I could just look at those things and say yes or no really quickly. So the time it took to regrade these was actually super fast. I could regrade one in usually under 2 minutes per assignment. It was really, really quick. But I didn't give them feedback directly. So how did I get them to figure out what they did wrong? Okay. So this is where I used class announcements and really encouraging students to come to my office hours or use, we had a class message board where we would discuss things, really encourage them to use that. So I gave them more like general guidance. Confirm you got the main question response correct first. Like, do you think you got this right? Or are you just like way off base here? Okay, that was like step 1. A lot of times that was the issue. They were just kind of way off and weren't understanding what it was asking necessarily. However, if they got that part right, but they still didn't earn credit, now it's time to look at the details. And I really use this as a place to emphasize with students where a novice might see something as an unimportant detail, but me as an expert, I can say, no, actually, this is crucial. So you're gonna have to think about what an example of that is in your field, but in my field, it is, for example, if you leave off an atom, it's now a different molecule. To a novice, that's a simple mistake or a minor thing. To us, it's actually a big deal. So really training that. So I gave them some guidelines. If you think you got the main thing correct, but you still didn't get credit, here are some things to check. And if you need more help, come see us for help. So it actually worked really well. It actually turned into conversations between me and the students about, well, why is this incorrect? And how do I fix it? A lot of them did come to do it. So they had one chance to do this for free. Any additional chance required a token. So it also really emphasized take it seriously the first time. And actually worked out great. So I just want to describe in general how that went so you have a sense of how to structure things. It actually went fine for me. The class was really well. The students generally liked it. So it turns out you can do specs quickly in a fast-paced online course, lecture course. The key things I did to make this work with my scale is consolidate those learning objectives or outcomes as much as possible and focused my grading time on the open-ended assessments, have the other things auto-graded. I built in options to reassess, revise, resubmit, but I limited them with the tokens. And then I really stressed using these metacognitive strategies as part of the revise, resubmit with the quiz corrections, and then offering the final exam as a last chance to reassess things. So for me, this is how this worked on a smaller class for me. That might be a larger class for you. So you can use some of these strategies to think about how to design that. Okay, so I'm actually going to hand this over now to Will, who's going to talk about how we did the really big class.
Yeah. So at this point, like Renee just said, we're going to pivot and start talking now about the massive organic chemistry laboratory course that Renee alluded to at the beginning of this presentation. And I'm going to start by going through things the same way that Renee did with the lecture course, give you some context for this laboratory course. So this is a class that is the first in a series of 3 and is taken by the same types of students as those that take the lecture course Renee had talked about. So that's a lot of biosciences, pharmaceutical sciences, pre-health. However, the chemistry major contingent is a lot smaller because they do have their own separate majors lab course series. So the few chemistry majors we get coming through this series tend to be transfer students or students who switch their major partway through their time in college. This particular lab course that we're going to talk about is offered during the winter term. It's a 10-week term. So the lecture series starts in the fall, but our lab series starts in the winter. And that's so we get this offset. Students can learn enough organic chemistry that by the time they get to the lab, we can jump right in and have them apply that knowledge. In terms of class support, that's so extensive, it really needs its own slide. And fortunately, you've already seen that slide a few times, both in a prior presentation and earlier in this one. So when Renee was talking about, hey, we've got this like 1,300 student thing with 36 TAs, this is the class we're now going to talk about for the remainder of the presentation. Because if we can introduce specs grading on this level, that should give you some, hopefully, good comfort knowing that if we can do it on this scale, there's a way for you to find a way to do it on your scale. So just like Renee did, I'm going to start with some of the learning outcomes. How did we determine what they are? And if you recall from the beginning of Renee's talk, she had started with 66 and she had to find a way to define them as essential or higher level and then pare them down. Fortunately, that's not the same challenge we have in the lab course. And that's because a lecture course is primarily what I would call a content-driven course. Students are introduced to a lot of new material, and there's a lot of variation in that material from chapter to chapter, topic to topic, and therefore a lot of unique individual learning outcomes. In contrast, lab is a process-driven course. And because it's process-driven, it's looking at students' application of content that they got from lecture courses and the development of transferable skills. And so for that reason, there are far fewer SLOs. And in our particular lab course, we've got a total of 6. And I'm going to summarize them briefly here. The first is to perform fundamental organic chemistry techniques in the context of laboratory experiments. The second is to demonstrate understanding of concepts underlying fundamental techniques by proposing solutions to actual or potential problems encountered during an experiment. The third is to accurately draw reaction mechanisms for reactions conducted in laboratory sessions. The fourth is to use spectroscopy data to determine structures of unknown molecules. The fifth is to use data collected from an experiment to make claims supported by evidence. And the last SLO is identify safe and unsafe practices related to techniques used in laboratory sessions. Now, you might be thinking that, okay, well, with only 6 learning outcomes, you must not then have very many assessments because you probably don't need that many to assess just 6 learning outcomes. But that's not true in this particular course because it is process-driven. Students are developing these transferable skills, they're applying knowledge, and we want to make sure that they're able to do that in a variety of different circumstances and scenarios. So meeting each outcome once is not actually sufficient. And the way that we're assessing whether students are meeting these outcomes is by looking at iterations of the same assessment. And what I mean by this is, I'm going to show you with an example here, using this 5th SLO from the prior slide as a reference. So that fifth SLO was to use data collected from an experiment to make claims supported by evidence. We assess that using post-lab reports, and we have one post-lab report per experiment in our course. We have a total of 6 experiments, therefore there are 6 post-lab reports. For students to earn a higher grade, they have to earn a satisfactory assessment on more post-lab reports throughout the term, which means that they've met this fifth SLO multiple times, which is showing us that they can do this in more than just one scenario. And that's important because we don't want students to only be able to do it in one place and have compartmentalized it. This is about developing a skill set that they can broadly apply. So for us, we defined earning a satisfactory assessment on 3 of 6 post labs as a C, 4 of 6 as a B, 5 of 6 as an A. So now that we have our SLOs in place, I'm actually going to walk you through some of the design choices we made in terms of implementing specifications grading into this particular course. I do want to provide some brief context that when we were going through this whole transition, we didn't actually start by converting the large course first. The first course in the series is about 1,000. The second course is still very large. The third course in the series is only about 40 to 60 students. So when we were piloting this, we actually started with the third course because it is a bad idea to try something very new with a lot of moving parts on a 1,000 student scale, because if something goes wrong, that is a nightmare to fix. So we tried it on the smallest of the 3 labs first, but we didn't want to approach it as a, well, let's design the small one and then we'll design the big one and then we'll design the one in the middle. Because there's no point if we are trying to, or let me rephrase that. We don't want to have to design 3 different things. It's a lot of work to just transition one course, let alone 3. And so part of our strategy was, if we're going to design the small one first, we better choose things that are going to be pertinent to the design for the large course. So if it doesn't work in the large course, there's no point in putting it in the small course because we're just going to have to reinvent a new approach when we get to the large course later. The other advantage of trying to approach the whole series collectively is if we design a system that works for all 3, then students can have hopefully some lowered anxiety because they're going to experience it for the first time in the first course and then not be as surprised when they get to a similar version of it in the later courses in the series. Whereas if we were designing a unique system for each course and it's different each time, students don't have the same expectations coming into the course. They're going to think it's going to be like what they saw in the prior course in the series. And if it's not, that may actually create other issues within that second course or third course in the series. So the 3 things we had to consider in terms of design when we were approaching this were rubrics, what to grade and how to grade it. So in other words, looking at these assessments, how many do we include and how do we actually determine what's critically graded and what is not? And third, our token economy, because we want to allow students opportunities to revise, resubmit, reassess on some of these things. And the best way to manage and track that is with a token economy. We just had to figure out how to make that token economy function for a 1,000 student course. So I'm going to start with the rubrics. And the first thing I want to emphasize here is this is not about how we designed them in the sense of it's not about how we took our rubrics that were under this points-based version and converted them into a specifications graded version. This is about you're going to have to do some degree of conversion. How can you minimize how much time and effort you have to spend converting a rubric over? And then the first example I'm going to give here is if you can reuse a rubric, please do that. You will be so happy you did not have to spend so much time converting every single individual rubric for each individual thing. So I'm going to give you an example for this course in the context of our in-lab notebook pages. And in-lab notebook pages are what students are filling out as they're completing the experiment within the lab. Most of the time, these filling out lab notebooks fall into a general outline that's pretty consistent from experiment to experiment. Every once in a while, there are slightly different things they need to include depending on the type of experiment, but for the most part, they're very, very similar. So what Renee, Kate, and I did is we went through and assessed which experiments fell into which type. Were they technique-driven about learning a new organic chemistry technique? Were they hypothesis-driven? Did they need to make some kind of a claim and then see if their results supported or refuted that hypothesis? or were they reaction driven? Were they based on the synthesis of a compound? If they didn't fit into one of those three major categories, we just left them as uncategorized, and those had to have their own unique rubrics. So we looked at all of the experiments across the three courses in the series and categorized them based on whether they were technique, hypothesis, or reaction driven. Of the 15 labs we have across these three courses, we only ended up needing to make 5 rubrics total. 1 technique-driven rubric, 1 hypothesis-driven rubric, 1 reaction-driven rubric, and then these 2 uncategorized ones required their own unique ones. So that's a total of 5. We were able to save a ton of time by designing 5 instead of 15. So if you end up in a situation where you're like, well, this is going to be a very similar type of assessment or rubric from experiment to experiment or topic to topic, try to reuse as much as you can where you can. The other strategy we took with rubrics, if we couldn't reuse an entire rubric, was to reuse pieces. And this was pertinent when we were converting the rubrics for the post-lab reports. Post-lab reports are unique to each individual experiment because students are describing the background, the results they got, and the interpretation of those results, all of which are specific to an experiment. So we couldn't broadly apply things across the board. And so all these little squares that I'm showing you here on these rubrics represent unique criterion for each report. And you'll notice that they're all different colors between each of the individual reports because there's no overlap. We're assessing different things because they're different for each experiment. However, there were some commonalities across all post labs and therefore all experiments. So for example, notice I have this yellow criterion in each of these post lab rubrics. That represents a conclusion criteria. The conclusion has the same wording and the same goal for students to meet, regardless of the experiment, regardless of the post lab. And so that was a place where we could craft the language for that criterion once and then copy and paste it to all the subsequent rubrics. So we didn't have to rewrite that same criterion over and over again. We just reused what we crafted the first time. So that saved us a little bit of time on something that otherwise would have taken a lot more time. At this point, I'm going to pass things over to Kate to continue.
Thanks, Will. So we'll talk to you about the first major aspect of specifications grading that we had to consider when we were converting our course materials, which were the rubrics. Now I'm going to go into how we approached the grading and assessment portion of the class. So as we all know, we all have a limited amount of time to actually devote to grading. We have a bunch of responsibilities as faculty, whether we are teaching track or research track faculty. So we have to be strategic in how we actually decide on which assessments we are going to include in the class, and then how are we going to assess those specific assessments. So questions that we started to ask ourselves as we developed this course were, okay, are there any assessments that we can actually use auto grading? Do we have an LMS? Yes, we have our Canvas LMS, and there are Canvas quizzes that we can use to auto grade assignments that are meant to help teach students material or that are meant to keep students on track in terms of actually doing a course component. So these can be used for things like reading comprehension quizzes or video quizzes. If in our case we had a lab, we had lab technique videos, so then they had to complete a quiz that assessed them on that quiz. We also thought, okay, are there any assignments that we can use just complete and incomplete grading? So there are multiple assignments that you can think of that have just components that are looking at, are you teaching the students the material as opposed to assessing students for specific learning outcomes? So you can incorporate complete and incomplete types of assessment for these rather than actually spending time grading them. A way to incorporate these is also to do peer or self-reflected grading. Now, we didn't actually use any course assessments that were focused on peer or self-grading, but we did. That is something we want to incorporate in the future because that is somewhere where students can critically analyze their own work or critically analyze a student's work. And then the real focus is giving feedback to those students as opposed to you grading them. So those three aspects are more of the, okay, how can you strategically approach grading, and how can you use tools at your disposal so you don't actually have to grade every single type of assessment for a student. Now, a major part of specs is the reassessment, revise, and resubmit aspect of the course, right? You want students to demonstrate that they have met certain learning outcomes, but you also want to give them the opportunity to demonstrate that they have learned from their mistakes if maybe they didn't achieve those learning outcomes at the beginning. And so Renee talked about that with her 51A class, where she had quizzes and then she had a second attempt for the quiz. So then students could demonstrate that retention, demonstrate that they have maintained those learning objectives. So the thing with the token and or the reassessment and the revise and resubmission opportunities is, how do you actually manage that? That seems like it might take a lot of time. So you have to be strategic in how many of those opportunities you actually give to students, and you can use a token system to help you limit the amount of revise and resubmit opportunities that you give students, so that way it won't become an extra burden on your grading. Now, I just gave you a little bit of a strategic outline of what kinds of things can you think about in order to reduce the amount of time you spend grading, just so you can manage it, right? And you focus on the grading that really gives a lot of a lot of feedback, so students can then learn from that feedback and apply that to future assignments. So we were wondering, how long does it actually take to grade, and is there a difference in grading points-based courses and specifications grading courses? So we had a huge number of TAs for this very large scale lab class. So we asked them, we said, okay, in the points-based course TAs, please self-report how much time you're spending on grading, and we did the same for the specifications grading course. So you can see how much time the TAs reported. But the thing I want to point out here is, in the specifications grading course, we asked the TAs to include the time that they use to grade, revise, and resubmit opportunities. And they still reported that they were spending the same amount of time grading as the TAs in the points-based grading course. Now, these results are corroborated by 11 other reports in the literature. And 6 of those reports say the same thing, where they self-reported how much time they were spending grading in a points-based version of their course and a specs grading version of their course, and they found no difference, just like us. And the other 5 cases, they actually reported that in the specifications grading course, even with the revise and resubmit opportunities, they spent less time on grading than in the points-based course. Now, we talk a lot about TAs. There are tons of TAs for this class, and you might ask yourself, well, if you have TAs to do your grading, then that means you don't have to do the grading. So does that mean you can devote more time to developing the specifications grading course? And we just wanted to point out here, when you have TAs on this scale, or when you have TAs in general, even if you just have 1 or 2, there are other management responsibilities, logistics responsibilities that you have to take into account as you manage a TA. So you might not be spending your time on the grading per se, but you are still spending the time in the course teaching TAs how to run their class, teaching TAs how to grade, just managing the course in general. So if you have TAs or if you do not have TAs, it doesn't necessarily change the amount of time that you are spending on a course if you are planning to convert a course from a points-based to a specifications grading system. Okay, so we talked about the rubric design, the assignments, and how you can strategically approach how or what kind of assignments you use and how you assess those assignments. Now we're going to talk about the token economy aspect. So a token economy is meant to be a way for students to exchange a token for opportunities, traditionally to do revise and resubmit opportunities or forms of reassessment. Now, in our case, we did that, but we did a little bit more. Since we have this huge scale course, we also use tokens as a means to help us just manage the course logistics at this huge scale. So I'm going to walk you through some examples here of tokens and what we use them for. Specifically, how did we use them to mitigate some logistical challenges at this large scale? So as I mentioned before, token economy has traditionally been used to allow students to revise and resubmit assignments. So in our case, we used, the students could have an opportunity to trade in 1 token to revise and resubmit a post-lab assignment within 72 hours. So we included this strategically because we wanted to give a time limit for the amount of, a limit on the amount of tokens that students could actually use in the course. And this is because we don't want to incentivize students to wait till the last minute, the end of the quarter, the end of the term, to actually resubmit everything. And this also helped with the TA grading burden. We didn't want to overwhelm them at the end of the semester or the quarter, so we incorporated this limit. Another thing about the limits, students were only allowed to use 1 token per post lab, so they didn't have an unlimited amount of tokens to use on these. And that was more of how we used it in the traditional sense, but we also used tokens as a way to manage course logistics. So students could submit 1 token as a 24-hour late pass. Now, you can imagine on a scale of 1,000 students, Renee would get lots and lots of emails for extenuating circumstances. Can I have a late pass here? My dog ate my homework, or, something happened in the family. So that can get challenging, because how do you be equitable in terms of giving students opportunities to have extensions? With a token system, that kind of mitigates the problem. We don't have to act as judge, jury, or executioner in this case, and students can submit a token for a 24-hour late pass, no questions asked. Now, there are a couple more different amounts of tokens that we used for higher stakes assignments, but I'm going to focus on the makeup lab option for the 3 tokens. So in a lab class, making up a lab is challenging, but if students need to make up a lab, there are safety considerations that you have to take into account, because you cannot actually accommodate enough, you can only accommodate a certain number of students in a lab course at a time. So if you have a lot of students who need to make up a lab, there is a lot of logistics in trying to figure out when they can make up the lab, and sometimes not all students can actually go to a specific time to make up that lab. So we incorporated this option as a way to mitigate that. If students couldn't go to any other section, or if every other section was at full capacity due to safety considerations, they could submit 3 tokens, and then that would just act as their makeup lab. So then there would still be that flexibility in the course. Now, not only do students need, did we include token opportunities for students to trade in tokens for opportunities to do different things, but we also gave them opportunities to earn extra tokens. So we included extra token opportunities for things like completing class surveys, and this was to incentivize feedback, right? Feedback for us and feedback for TAs. We also gave the students opportunities to earn extra tokens if for 4 consecutive weeks, the entire section had no safety issues. Now, safety is a huge concern in lab sections in general, because we are dealing with a lot of safety of chemicals, and students need to learn how to be safe. And we incorporate different assessments for safety, but this is a way to incentivize students to really develop a practice of safety throughout the entire quarter. Finally, we included extra token opportunities for students that were metacognitive activities that we wanted to incorporate into the course, but weren't necessarily content-specific activities. So this is, for example, we used an activity at the very beginning of the semester for students to actually earn their initial tokens. And this reflection activity was a how to earn an A assignment. So essentially, the students were prompted with a scenario of, okay, figure out what kind of grade you want to earn in the class. And you might say, well, all students want to earn an A. And while yes, many students do, and I'm sure if students are pre-med or they want to go to professional school of some kind, they're aiming for that A. But sometimes students are taking this class just because they need to graduate. So they might be saying, okay, I just need to pass. I need to get a B or a C. I'd like a B, but we'll see what happens. So giving them a reflection assignment at the beginning of the semester, of the quarter or the term, to have them think through this process helps to instill a kind of more proactive approach to the course, as opposed to reacting as they go. So those were the reasons behind why we use the token economy. So now I'm going to show you how we actually manage our token system. So on the students' part, I mentioned there was a reflection assignment, so students have to submit a reflection assignment to actually earn their first 4 tokens in the course. And then after they earn the first 4 tokens, there is a assignment on the course LMS, in our case Canvas, and the score is the token balance. So students can use that token balance to decide, okay, I have enough tokens to do something. They review a token trade-in list, they decide what they want to use, and then we have a Google form to actually manage this process. So students can go in and fill out the Google form, indicate how many tokens they want to use and for what opportunity. They then receive a copy of their responses, and then they have to email those responses to their TA. And then the TA can go in and actually implement whatever opportunity they wanted. So they could change a pre-lab score, or they could actually regrade the revise and resubmit opportunity for the post-lab. So that's all on the student and TA side, mostly the student. On the instructor side, all we have to do to manage it is actually go in and subtract the token balances from the course LMS. So that means we look at that assignment score on Canvas and we change it based on the token request. And then we track in the comments feature on that assignment what the token balance was actually for, just to facilitate easy communication between us, and sometimes we'd have the head TA do it, or if the TA actually has to go in and see if that token balance was redeemed.
All right, so I'm going to take back over again here at the very end and just kind of summarize the takeaways for this particular organic chemistry laboratory course. And the main one, just to say up front, is specifications grading is amenable to large courses. It can definitely be done. It was successful in this particular course of over 1,000 students. And we were able to make this amenable in part because of 3 major things. We were able to reuse rubrics in part or in whole where it was appropriate, which saved a tremendous amount of time in the design part of the course. We also made very strategic decisions about what students could or could not revise, resubmit, reassess. And that was important because we wanted to control how much time we and our TAs were going to spend grading. And we were very fortunate that we didn't see the grading time increase when we went from points-based to specifications grading. And finally, we constructed a token economy to not only help us track and manage revision, resubmission, reassessment, but to also give students other opportunities throughout the course. And this worked well by creating an assignment in the LMS where we could track a token balance and also leave comments so that we could clearly relay information between us as the instructors, our TAs, and our students. And having students be able to make those requests through a Google form, or you could use some other type of survey software to keep track of those token requests, worked really well, because the alternative would be that everything goes through your email inbox, and having things delegated elsewhere worked quite well. And last but not least, just to summarize this whole presentation, both Renee's lecture and the lab, we have some things we want to share with you in terms of how to approach specifications grading in your course, starting with the idea that there are many ways to do this. We've talked about a couple. You've seen previous presenters like Julie Mendez and Robert Talbert give their own examples, Kate and Steve for their writing course. So there's a variety of ways that it can be done, but you have to figure out what works for you. And the reason you have to do that is because your implementation is dependent on a variety of different things. That includes what type of course you have, how many students you have, what level of support you have, and so many other variables. It doesn't mean you can't do it. You just have to figure out what you have to finagle that is going to then make it work for your particular set of variables. But we have some general strategies for you, regardless of what type of course you're interested in converting. The first thing is, if you have SLOs, in particular, if you have defined certain SLOs as core or essential, things that students need for later in the major or later in a course series, those are the assessments you want to prioritize to give students opportunities to revise, resubmit, and reassess. If you're not sure whether you have core SLOs, another way that you can think about this is, what type of assessments do you have in your current class that you have a lot of weight on? What do you think is really important in your course? And that's really the thing you want to emphasize students having opportunities to revise, resubmit, reassess. That being said, that's where you want to prioritize it. You want to limit it everywhere else. So like Kate had described earlier, we used auto grading or complete incomplete on a lot of the other assessments because we didn't have the time and bandwidth to grade everything critically. And frankly, you don't really have to. You want to make sure that you're emphasizing the things that are most important. And it's okay to let some of those other things down, dial it back a little. For this revision, resubmission, reassessment, definitely decide what limit you're going to impose on them. How many times can someone revise, resubmit, reassess, and within what time frame? That's so important to control the grading burden, especially in the case that students are prone, based on literature precedent, to abuse revision, resubmission, reassessment. They tend to take a shotgun approach if you don't have a limit. In other words, if you say, revise and resubmit as many times as you want, whenever you want, that's going to be an issue, because then you're not necessarily getting students to focus on the, oh, if I didn't do well the first time, I need to change something. Because there's no limits and there's no incentive for them to change their behavior. If there was a 10% chance they were going to pass that assessment the first time and they have unlimited attempts whenever they want, they're just going to keep going and going and going until they get it. But it will be that they got it based on statistical chance and luck, not because they actually really studied and prepared and knew that material to demonstrate that they met that outcome for a good reason. And then finally here, using a token economy helps you manage and track those limits on the revision, resubmission, reassessment. And then in addition, if you have the bandwidth for this, throw in things that will incentivize good habits and strategies and metacognitive reflection, things that we would like students to be doing on a regular basis, but are not necessarily things they've been taught or exposed to previously.
Okay, so that's everything we have for you, but we wanted to make sure we save at least a few minutes at the end here for questions. So fire away, we're happy to answer anything and everything.
So I have a question. I'm actually really interested in what Will just said about literature supporting the idea that students will do this freeloading thing, because I was blindsided when my students started doing this quarter. They knew they had a free resubmission opportunity on their lab reports without using tokens. And so they just turned in lab reports half done and figured, oh, I'll get it on the resubmission, which is obviously not optimal, because then they don't get any feedback on half the lab report or whatever they didn't finish. And then their resubmission is still not as good as it could be. So, I mean, I'd be really interested in seeing that literature, because I didn't even know it existed.
Yeah, Steve, I actually ran into that. I didn't run into it the first time I did this, but I ran into it last quarter, and I didn't even have the free resubmits. I had students turning in blank assignments on the first try, and then basically just to get extra time so they could resubmit after the TA released grades. So they just used it to get like a 2-week extension. And so we had to put we had to cut that. And we said, no. Your first attempt has to be a real attempt. Otherwise you don't resubmit.
I haven't had a blank one yet, but I also I have what you would consider a small class right now. So
I got memes. I got blanks. I also got memes as the submission, which was interesting.
Oh, really? Wow.
I'm looking at Ted's question on the regrading against the rubric. So I think, Ted, tell me if this is what you're asking. When you use a rubric in Canvas, you can mark the rubric items. When a student resubmits to the same assignment in Canvas, the rubric doesn't change. You can still see what it was marked the original time. And so we use that to go, okay, we already know what they missed, so we only need to look at those things. Is that what you were asking about?
Well, I guess what I don't know about or never done is actually done a resubmission within Canvas. So maybe that's the whole part I don't understand.
So you can do it for assignments. For quizzes, it's an extra attempt, but under this assignment, the only thing you do is you don't close the assignment. You put a due date, but you don't end it.
Okay.
So late.
And so when they resubmit, does it, I mean, my submissions often come in as like files. Mm-hmm. And so you get a separate file and then you see the rubric from the first time. Is that what? Yep. Okay, thank you.
And you have access to the original file as well in case you need to compare it.
Right, okay.
I have a quick question. As far as the Google form that you used to get the tokens going, was it just name, section, I have 4 tokens, I want to turn in one to get a 3-day extension on a revision or something?
So, sorry, the question is about the form. Yeah, the form is very detailed. It says, like, what are you trying to do? So it actually has like, tell me what you want. So we built in all the things, all the options we give them is built into the form. And that is build your form carefully. Build your form to be very explicit for what you're looking for. There's nothing that's open-ended. There's nothing they type in, they just select choices because I let them type in, they are not very good at explaining to me what they're trying to do. Yeah.
Okay.
And I use the option where Google Forms takes you to different sections to like redirect.
Oh, okay.
There's certain things that don't need to go to the TA. So like if it's something that my class has a lab lecture component. And so we didn't talk about that, but there's a lab lecture piece. And one of the things they can do is like get lab lecture credit. Like they can replace one missed lab lecture credit or something like that. The TA doesn't need to see that because the TA just handles the lab section. So if they're asking to do that, when they get to the end, it says like, you don't need to forward this because then I just see the spreadsheet on the back end. Whereas if they're doing a revise and resubmit, the TA needs to see that. So it says, make sure you forward the confirmation email to your TA so they know it's okay to regrade your work. I would say about 90% of them follow instructions. And then the other 10% say, why haven't you regraded my work yet? And the TA says, well, are you supposed to send me something? And then it works out.
Right.
So 90% is great. For me, that still means like 100 plus people who don't follow instructions, but that's just the nature of large classes. I wanted to address something. Lynn was asking in the chat, are there any group assignments? Not in lab, so they work as lab partners during the class, but they all submit their own work. In the lecture class, the only group activity, they have group activities during class time, during synchronous class time for the flipped version of the class. So they submit one thing per group for that. But that's just a yes, no, did you do it or not grading. Okay, so James' question, is it more or less complex? All grading systems are complex. The reality is the only reason students have more questions about it because they haven't seen it before. I can guarantee you that most students do not understand how their grade is calculated in most classes, period. Because students actually have a hard time with weighted averages and what that means. And then if you have a curve on top of weighted average, it's more complicated. They don't understand that. And then if you have multiple sections where you can normalize with a curve with weighted averages, they have absolutely no idea what's going on. So is it more complex? No. You ask a lot of questions about it. Yes, just because it's a different thing. But I have the students in a sequence. So they ask a lot of questions in the very first time they see it. And the second time they see it, they ask for fewer questions. And those who go on to the third quarter class ask literally no questions. They already know what they're doing. So anytime you do something new, and I have this experience too, because I did flip class stuff in the very early days of it, you will always get questions about a thing that is different, period. And they will always tell you it's complicated. It's not because it's complicated, it's because it's not the thing they have experienced for the last 20 years of their life.
Yeah. Can I actually jump in on that and add something to that, Renee? For something that's really pertinent to that comment there is they are going to not necessarily get it right away. And like Renee said, it's because it's new. It's not because it's any more difficult or challenging in any other way compared to any other grading system. But because it is new, the first time you implement something, I would say be prepared that the commentary you're going to get in student evals the first time is going to have some degree of bimodality. You're going to have some people that figured it out and it clicked and they're like, oh, this is why we're doing it. This is why it's helpful. This is what it does for me and it empowers me as a student. And then you'll have a lot of students that might comment along the lines of, I want to go back to the way things were. But a lot of that commentary is derived from that's familiar to me and you just upended what I'm used to. And so it's more reactionary to you making a change and them not understanding that it's actually beneficial to them.
Yeah, I get that. Interesting. I get students who say, I want to go back to the original version, but then if I figure out like, this is the grade you would have gotten in like a points version, it's actually lower. I was like, do you really want that version back? Because you would have had a far lower grade in this class with that version. So there's interesting, they don't always recognize, many students do recognize like, hey, this is better because I get to try again. But not everyone does. And it is just the normal, humans are uncomfortable with change. We as a species are uncomfortable with change. It's just what we are. I wanted to say also, Stephen and Hillary were talking in the chat, but I do sometimes get pushback about, oh, this isn't fair, it's a time limit. And what I explain to them is your TAs are people also, and you cannot abuse their time. I have to be respectful of my grad students' time as well. And and also my own time. And so I often find I have to reiterate to students that we are humans, not robots. And that what they are asking for is ultimately unreasonable. And when I put it in those terms, they quite often go, yeah, okay, that makes sense. I started to explain to them that your TAs work 20 hours a week and they are only paid to work 20 hours a week. Why are you asking me to make them work 40? And the students step back and go, oh, I didn't know that. And so once they understand like there's constraints on this and we're doing the best we can within those constraints, you get a lot less pushback because they realize they're like, okay, yes, I do not live in this fantasy perfect world where one person can devote all their time to my needs individually. But they just don't always recognize how that works. So it's really good to like pull the curtain back and show them like what constraints we're working with.
I have sort of maybe it's an equity question. I'm not sure. Should you give a token for sickness or a doctor's note or anything like that? I don't have an answer or a thought. It just seems plausible that.
What do you mean?
Well, if there's a pretty standard grading practice, like, oh, I have 15 quizzes and everyone drops 2, and that's very inequitable because if you're never sick, say, you get to drop your worst 2 quizzes, and if you are sick twice, you drop 2 random quizzes. So the person who wasn't sick is being treated inequitably in a way. So yeah, should sickness or doctor's note or any item of note, let's say full-time job, should anything like that for equity reasons provide a token? Is just off the top of my head. I don't know what to think about.
The way I address this is I say, if you're asking me for just a quick, like, hey, I just need an extra 24 hours, please use a token because that's what they're there for. And also I have limited time to address things. And they said, but if you have something bigger going on, like you have a systemic issue going on where you're like I had someone who was a single mom with a small kid and we're like, she's like, I can't, like, just the particular schedule is a problem. Can we talk about this? And she and I just worked out a different due date for her. She's like, I need literally an extra 12 hours so I can work on things after my kid goes to bed. I was like, consistently? Like, yes. Like, cool, done. And that was just a thing we arranged between the two of us, and that was the end of it. And I figured, like, that is how I'm going to handle it. So I always invite the students. I say, like, if you're pleased, if it's one little issue, like a one-time thing, it's a little issue, just do the token because it's easier for everybody. You don't have to email me. I don't need an explanation. Just do that way. But if it's a consistent issue or if it's a major issue, like some big thing is happening, please talk to me. And I really push them to tell me, I said, you don't have to tell me what it is, just tell me that something is happening. Because one, that lets me think like, okay, let's figure out what you need to be successful. Or maybe you actually need to withdraw for this particular class. Like, can I help you do that if it's to an extreme case? Or can I make sure you're getting put in touch with campus resources? So I really do, or if I see a student submitting tokens for the same thing over and over, I will start asking, like, hey, what's going on? So can we actually find you some other help? And so by freeing up those like one-off, I just need an extra 24 hours to do something through tokens, that frees up my time to help the students who are having those bigger issues. And basically what I come down to with instance is like, tell me what you need. And if it's remotely possible within the constraints that I'm working with, we will make that happen.
The other thing I'll throw in there is the total number of tokens that students get was based off of making sure that students, if they wanted to, could revise and resubmit every post lab and then still have things left over as a buffer. And that was to ensure that if you had a case where it was out of your control and you had to use a 24-hour late pass, that then wasn't going to prevent you from revising and resubmitting something later. So we did give that extra buffer in the total number of tokens for that reason.
We usually end up at about a max of 8 or so tokens in the class, and that's more than enough for most things. Cameron's hand was up. Hi, Cameron.
Hi, Renee. How are you?
I haven't seen you in a while.
Good. Yeah, I guess I was just going to comment on the equity issue because I would look more into that about like your argument and how it's unequitable if people are sick versus not sick, because there's actually a lot out there on how giving people excuses for sickness or not is actually less equitable than a token system like this. So I just wanted to point out that that argument is like kind of a reverse argument on equity versus like a token system where you don't have to show proof of why, because some people won't even know that their thing would qualify as proof because they don't understand like the system of like, you know, and even people's interpretation of being sick or having an emergency or different things that they're handling, you know, with homelessness or different things. So I would just challenge everyone to think about like equity as a whole in a new way. And I think that the token system in this way is like 100% more equitable to give every student an opportunity without having to divulge or explain the reasoning behind it.
I can say also, like, as a first gen student, there were a lot of times like I didn't know you could ask for things. I was not aware that that was a thing that you could do. It's a combination of being first gen and just like the way my parents were like, no excuses. So I was like, wait, you can ask for extra time on something? This is a thing that happens? I figured that out somewhere towards the end of college. And I'm like, well, that would have been good to know earlier. So building in a system where it's just automatically part of it is actually, I think, a better way to go, or at least something to consider as a better way to go. Oh, yes. Okay. Patricia's question in chat. Have you noticed any change in the relationship? Yes. Actually, I'm going to because Kate and Will are new faculty, I'm going to let them talk about their experiences here.
I'll go really quick. So I had done a lot of work with Renee in building all this class, and it was nice to see a lot of the positive responses to how Specs gives them all these different opportunities and gives them a lot more ownership and transparency. Those are the biggest things that they tend to comment on is I actually get to learn something because I actually get to revise and resubmit, which I really never get to do in any other course. And I know exactly what you're expecting of me. I don't have to guess and I don't have to hope that my grade is what I'm hoping it's supposed to be. Those are the most positive comments I get with Specs grading, which is wonderful. And then I came to Georgia Tech, and in my first semester here, I kind of had to do like a hybrid-ish system because I'm teaching lab here and I couldn't just like trade out all the existing lab content here. I had to just kind of ride it through for a semester and be like, well, this is what they got. This is what I got to run with. And I didn't feel comfortable doing a full Specs grading implementation in a course that was not mine, that I had not fully designed. And so I had a lot of traditional elements still in place. And I noticed at the end when I got a lot of the arguments of, well, can you just push me up a little bit? Or I should get this exception because I put in all this effort, or I did this, that, or the other thing. And a lot of those more confrontational feeling discussions became more prevalent again. And I was like, yeah, okay, that was gone. And I really don't like that I'm seeing it again. I'd like that to be gone again. So I found that a lot more of the interactions I had under Specs were more about just positive feelings about what we had set up for them, or more focused on, I'm trying to learn this, can you point me in the right direction, as opposed to, I should get this credit because, and usually it's related to a feeling of I put in the time and effort, therefore that should be rewarded, as opposed to I put in the quality of work and I have demonstrated that I have met this outcome. Very rarely do I get those arguments under the traditional point system.
Yeah, I would agree. I found that students have gotten much less defensive with the Specs grading system. It's less of like, how dare you give me these points? And it's more of like, okay, I didn't meet this outcome, but I think I addressed it here. Like, and then you can explain to them, well, you didn't actually address this outcome, or you know what, you have a part of it, but you didn't actually do the entire thing. Or in a lot of our rubric items, we have like clearly, like students did this clearly or demonstrated. And I can say, well, you have parts, but you didn't articulate it in such a way that I or your TA knew that you understood what you were trying to say. So, I mean, everything that Will said is true. I've found that not all students, of course, I haven't talked to every single one, but many students have given me a lot of verbal and email feedback saying like, thank you, I feel like I learned so much in this system. And I've had a very positive experience.
I think the only negative response that I've gotten, and this usually comes mostly from students who don't fully understand the system or who are more comfortable in the traditional system, is a lot of things under the specifications grading system are you either met or did not meet. And so there's no in-between partial credit element. And that is something that students have definitely learned over time is their safety net. And so when you take that away, it feels like they tend to interpret it as, well, I did all this stuff, and if I don't meet that outcome, you're literally giving me nothing. When they're so used to getting something, even if it's not good work at all, they're so used to getting something, that participation trophy kind of feeling. So that's something that doesn't fully go away, but definitely that concern gets lessened over time when they get more comfortable with the idea of, oh, it's not a one and done. I can like learn from my mistake and I have another chance. So that compensates quite a bit.
One of the things I think that helps with that is to really think about your language that you're using. So the students will see when they don't meet the passing threshold on an assignment, they'll say, I failed it. And I immediately correct them. So no, you didn't. You just didn't pass it yet. You didn't fail it. You just didn't pass it yet. Let's fix it. In the same way, I know I give them an example. It's like I submit a paper for publication and it comes back as needs revision every single time. I did not fail the publication. I just didn't get it published yet. Right. And so I give them the example. It's like, this is normal. And I think a huge thing is normalizing that, because students feel like I submit a thing and if it's not good, I failed. And we are not good at explaining to students that that is rarely reality. Or maybe you failed at this attempt, but you get to try again. Right. And so kind of reemphasizing like, this is normal. Almost nothing I do is good enough on the first try. You take that critique, you improve it, and you submit something that's even better. And so I've actually talked to a student who was really resistant, really, really angry, like, she was emailing me. I said, let's talk. Let's not email, let's talk. Said, I spent all this time, I did this, I did that, I should pass this. And I said, okay, let's look at what you actually did. This is not even, like, you're actually saying the completely wrong thing here. This is like the opposite of correct. It's exactly wrong. I can see you don't understand this, and here, and here. And I said, if I let you pass this, I'm harming you. I am hurting you by making you think you know something when you don't know it. So you didn't fail, but we have some issues we need to work on. So rather than you rant at me about how unfair this is, let's fix this. Why don't we talk about why you don't understand this? You clearly are missing something here. No. And that student started showing up to office hours regularly, asking those questions. And by the end, she's like, you know what? You're right. Because if I had just gotten credit for it, I would have just moved on. But the fact that you said, no, this is not good enough, you need to fix it, forced me to think about what I was doing wrong and get it. And now I understand what I was doing. And like, that is the entire point. And when they get that, that's the best part. They're like, I see what you're doing here. But sometimes it takes a little while to get to that point. So really thinking about, how do you describe it? It's like, if I could fix one thing, I would make it so that I can call the assignment graded in Canvas anything I wanted. And instead of it being complete and complete or whatever, I would call it like, good enough or not good enough yet. And I would include the yet as a reminder of like, it's not failing. You didn't fail. We just need to work on it some more. That was a very long answer to that question. Sorry.
I thought it was interesting that you had one element, which was the online homework. I don't know if that was sapling. Is that what sapling is? Yeah, you had this one element that you're like, well, honestly, there's no way to do it except through ordinary points. Do you have any commentary about including something that you kind of just have to do as ordinary points and incorporating that into spec-based?
Yeah, we do that with our, we have it in one other thing we didn't put just for time purposes, but like I have video quizzes because I need them to watch some pre-lab video stuff before lab, otherwise they're dangerous. So I have those as like a percentage, but I don't use it as their actual grade. It's a piece of that plus minus part of the grade. And it's pretty straightforward. It's like, what I did is I went through and they're like, what do most students typically get? Like, it's pretty easy to get 85% of above if you're at all paying attention, because there's the options to like, you only lose a small percent to try again if you get something wrong, etc. I said, okay, if you get above like 85% on this category of thing overall, that's part of adding a plus to your letter grade. And most students will get that. I actually see this interesting thing in my grades now of like, there's a lot of the pluses Like there's way more B pluses than Bs. That makes sense. Because those are those little things that add up. And so anything that's like a standard percent like that, I tend to lump into that like plus minus category and try to de-emphasize it.
My question is, let's say that you were able to transition a class that was previously on a letter graded scale to specs grading, and it was 1-to-1. Someone who turned in the exact same work in the old system was getting the exact same score based on the specs grading system in the new system. Do you see an improvement based on this this feedback loop where students have the opportunity to resubmit, where they are doing disproportionately better than they would in the old system, all other things held constant?
So that is actually something Steve is seeing in his classes, right? Steve, oh no, Steve's still here. He is. Steve, you're seeing
I am
that.
still here, yeah.
Yeah. You're seeing that with your,
Yeah, for sure. So I teach a combined lecture lab class as well. And the, in-class assignments and lecture quizzes and things like that, there's not a huge difference, but what's really a big change is the lab reports. So students who would have gone the whole quarter turning in, maybe C plus, B minus work, are now, as the quarter goes on, improving their lab reports from, unsatisfactory or needs revision at the beginning to high passes, like meeting all the criteria or close to all the criteria at the end. And it's, part of it's because they're getting used to the grading system, but a lot of it is that I think that this specifications grading encourages them to fix problems that they may have otherwise been okay with leaving in before. So like a good example from my classes is significant figures, right? There were some students before who just never bothered to learn how to express significant figures correctly based on the uncertainty in the number. They just didn't care. And they would lose 5 points per lab report or whatever. And it was like, okay, who cares? I'm not going to fix it. But now they miss an entire criteria. There's one whole criteria dedicated to sig figs and uncertainties in units. And if they miss that, they're halfway to not getting a high pass anymore. They're halfway to getting a low pass. And that's a big incentive. And so they fix it. They figure it out. It's definitely been noticeable.
Will, do you also want to mention the thing we're theoretically working on when we have time?
Yeah, so something else we're doing on those lines is we did have a bunch of independent graders come in and have them grade, and we just chose a post lab at random from the course, and we graded it using the same rubric for both students that had submitted the work under the points-based course and students that submitted under the specs grading course, because we wanted to see how is our quality of work changing, if at all. And the biggest goal, of course, is bare minimum. We don't want to see quality going down if we're giving them these opportunities to revise, resubmit, relearn. And part of the reason we also thought it was really important to do this was to try to combat a common concern with specifications grading, which is that it potentially reduces the rigor of a course, which is not a great argument. And I encourage anyone here who hasn't had the opportunity to look up the definition of rigor to definitely do so. Marissa was here earlier, and I actually got this from her. The definition of rigor is actually quite negative, and it's definitely not what we mean when we use that term. And so for us, it's more important to see that the quality of work at bare minimum is not going down. And that's what we found. We did not see the quality of work go down. It was statistically insignificant differences. We got about the same quality of work, but we did look at a post lab that was early in the course. And because it's the first course in the series, they haven't had a lot of practice up until that point, which is why we suspect we don't see a lot of differences. If we had looked at one later in the course or in the subsequent course, we suspect we'd probably see larger gains. But that's a study that's ongoing that we haven't collected all the data and analyzed just yet.
We also looked at exam questions across different courses, and we're seeing some potentially, we haven't gotten to the details of it yet, but there's some potential that we're seeing an improvement for off-sequence students, which is a big deal because they're the students who actually struggle the most and we're seeing some real interesting, possibly outsized effects with those. But we still have to dig into the exact details and make sure it is a real thing that we're seeing, which is the thing that we will do, as I keep saying, as soon as we can stop recreating classes online for like 5 minutes.
Oh, yeah, going back and regrading old lab reports is on my list too. And man, it just sounds like such an undertaking.
Yeah, we bribed some grad students.
Thanks so much for those answers. That was a fantastic talk.